I always thought my life with Emily was a painting, vivid, intricate, a masterpiece of shared years. We'd been married for 12 winters, our home a quiet brick sanctuary on the edge of town, where the trees whispered secrets to the wind. She was a florist, her hands perpetually dusted with pollen, her laughter a melody that greeted me after long days managing the lumberyard. I'm Jacob, a man of routine, coffee at dawn, ledger books by noon, her smile at dusk. Our rhythm was steady, predictable, until the day I found the first crack in the canvas. It was a Tuesday, the air crisp with autumn's bite. I'd come home early, my boots still caked with sawdust, expecting to find her arranging lilies in the kitchen. Instead, the house was silent, save for a faint hum from upstairs. Curious, I climbed the steps, my heavy tread muffled by the rug she'd chosen years ago. The bedroom door was ajar, and there she stood, Emily, before the mirror, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders. She wore a dress I didn't recognize, crimson and clinging. Her lips painted a shade I'd never seen her choose. She didn't notice me at first, too absorbed in her reflection, her fingers tracing the fabric as if it held a promise. "New dress?" I asked, leaning against the frame. She startled, her eyes darting to mine in the glass, a flicker of something, guilt, crossing her face before she smiled. "Oh, Jacob, you're home early." "Yes, I bought it for a client meeting tomorrow. Thought I'd try something different." Her voice was light, but it trembled at the edges, a note off-key. I nodded, accepting it, though the dress seemed less suited for flowers and more for eyes I couldn't place. That night, she curled against me in bed, her warmth familiar, yet I couldn't shake the image of her in that crimson shadow, a stranger in my wife's skin. Days passed, and the unease grew roots. She started leaving the house more, errands, she said, or late nights at the shop. I trusted her, or I told myself I did. But trust is a fragile thing, and mine began to splinter when I found the receipt. Tucked in her coat pocket, crumpled like an afterthought, it listed a dinner for two at La Belle Étoile, a restaurant we'd never visited together. The date was last Friday, when she'd claimed a delivery kept her late. I held that paper, my pulse a dull thud, and wondered who had sat across from her, tasting wine while I ate reheated stew alone. I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I watched. Her phone became a guarded treasure, her fingers swift to lock it when I entered a room. Her scent shifted to floral, yes, but laced with something muskier, foreign. I told myself it was nothing, that 12 years couldn't unravel over a dress or a receipt. But then came the call. Late one evening, the landline rang, and I answered before she could. A man's voice, smooth and unfamiliar, asked for her. "She's in the shower," I said, my grip tightening. "Who's this?" Pause, then, "Just a friend. Tell her Mark called." He hung up, and I stood there, the name Mark echoing like a hammer against my ribs. Mark. The name lodged in my throat, a jagged stone I couldn't swallow. Emily emerged from the bathroom, towel-wrapped, her skin flushed from the steam. "Who was on the phone?" she asked, casual as rain. I studied her, searching for a tell. A twitch, a blush, but her face was a mask of calm. "Some guy named Mark," I said, keeping my tone even. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she laughed. A sound too bright, too brittle. "Oh, Mark. He's a supplier. Probably about those new orchids. I'll call him tomorrow." She brushed past me, her damp hair grazing my arm, and I let her lie settle between us like dust. That night I didn't sleep. I lay beside her, listening to her breathing, steady and untroubled, while my mind churned. Who was Mark, really? A supplier didn't call at 10 p.m. A supplier didn't dine at La Belle Étoile. I needed proof, something concrete to hold against her words. The next morning, while she showered again, longer than usual, I slipped her phone from her purse. The lock code was our anniversary, a detail that stung as I typed it. Messages loaded, and there it was, a thread with M. No last name, just an initial, but the words were a blade. "Missed you last night." One read, time-stamped Friday. Her reply, "You too." Next time, no interruptions. Another, "Wear the red again." Drives me wild. My chest tightened, the air thinning as I scrolled. Photos followed, her in that crimson dress, smiling at a candlelit table, and then a man's hand, resting on hers, a silver ring glinting. I snapped a picture of the screen with my own phone, my hands shaking, before locking hers and setting it back. She emerged minutes later, humming, oblivious to the storm brewing in me. I went to work, but the lumberyard blurred into noise. Saws whining, men shouting, none of it piercing the fog of her betrayal. Mark wasn't just a fling. He was a presence, woven into her days while I stacked planks and signed invoices. I drove home that evening, the receipt burning a hole in my pocket, and decided to dig deeper. Her laptop sat on the kitchen table, rarely used, but a gateway nonetheless. She was out, another errand, and I logged in with her password, the same anniversary code. Emails loaded, and there, buried in a folder labeled Shop, was a reservation confirmation for a weekend getaway. 2 names, Emily Carter and Mark Ellison. Next month, a cabin in the mountains. The audacity of it, planning ahead, as if I were a footnote, lit something dark in me. I printed the email, the paper trembling in my grip, and sat in the dim kitchen, waiting. She returned an hour later, her cheeks rosy, her excuse a mumbled tale of a delayed delivery. I didn't challenge her. Not yet. I needed more, his face, his life, the shape of the man who'd slipped into mine. That night, I searched Mark Ellison online, cross-referencing her contacts, her world. A hit. A real estate agent, 42, slick smile in a headshot, office 20 miles away. The ring in the photo matched. It was him. Knowing his name didn't ease the ache. It sharpened it. Mark Ellison became a ghost in my house, his shadow stretching over every memory I'd built with Emily. I saw him in her glances, her hurried departures, the way she'd linger in the mirror. I couldn't unsee it now. The crimson dress, the wine, the hand on hers. 12 years, and she traded me for a man with a polished grin and a corner office. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Rage simmered, yes, but beneath it was a colder current, a need to understand how deep this ran before I struck back. I started tracking her. Subtle at first. A glance at her car's mileage, a note of when she left and returned. She didn't notice, too caught up in her secret orbit. Thursday, she said she'd be late, a client dinner. I nodded, kissed her forehead, and waited 10 minutes after her taillights faded before following. Her shop was dark when I passed, no sign of her van. I drove to La Belle Étoile, heart pounding, and there it was, her vehicle in the lot, parked beside a sleek black sedan. Through the restaurant's window, I saw them. Emily, radiant in a blue dress, laughing across from him. Mark Ellison, flesh and blood, leaning close, his hand brushing hers. I didn't storm in. I sat in my truck, the engine off, watching. They lingered over dessert, her eyes bright in a way I hadn't seen in months. When they left, he guided her to his car, his palm at her back, and they drove off together. I followed, keeping distance, my headlights dim. They wound through town, past the park, to a street of tidy condos. His place, I assumed, as they disappeared inside. I parked across the road, the clock ticking past midnight, until she emerged, hair mussed, lips swollen, climbing into her van. She drove home, and I trailed, silent as a predator. She slipped into bed beside me at 2 a.m., whispering an apology about a long meeting. I feigned sleep, her lie a weight on my chest. The next day, I called in sick, drove to his office, a glass-fronted building with his name on a plaque. I watched him through the window, chatting with clients, unaware of the eyes boring into him. He was handsome. I'd give him that tall, dark hair, a confidence I'd never carried. But he was a thief, and I was no longer the passive husband. I needed leverage, something to twist this back on them both. That afternoon, I hired a man. Discreet, expensive, a shadow who asked no questions. Photos, I said. Proof. Everything. He nodded, took my cash, and vanished into the city. I waited, the days stretching, each one a test of my restraint. Emily grew bolder, her excuses flimsier. Late nights, weekend workshops. I smiled through it, played the fool while the shadow worked. A week later, an envelope slid under my door. Images of them. Kissing in his car, entering his condo, her in that crimson dress again, draped over him on a balcony. And a note. He's married too. Wife's name is Claire. A new thread to pull. Claire. The name was a spark, igniting a plan that had been smoldering since I'd seen Mark's hand on Emily's. If he had a wife, then he had a life to lose, just as I did. I held the photos, the evidence of their tangled lies, and felt the first pulse of control. Revenge wasn't enough, it had to be precise, a blade that cut them both where it hurt most. Emily thought she could drift into this other world and leave me clutching scraps. Mark thought he could take what wasn't his. They'd underestimated me, and that was their mistake. I found Claire Ellison online. A blonde woman with a sharp jaw, a realtor like her husband. Her smile plastered across listings for suburban homes. She had no idea, I guess, just as I'd been blind. I debated telling her outright, but that was too simple, too quick. Instead, I watched her too. She worked from the same office as Mark, their desks a floor apart, a perfect facade of partnership. I wondered if she smelled Emily's perfume on him, if she questioned his late nights. I needed her as an ally, but not yet. Not until I'd built the trap. Emily's getaway loomed, the mountain cabin a week away. She'd started packing, casual mentions of a solo retreat, to clear her head. I nodded, offered to carry her bag, my voice steady while my mind raced. The shadows photos kept coming, more dinners, more stolen moments, and I filed them away, a growing arsenal. But I wanted something undeniable, something that would shatter their illusion when I pulled the curtain back. I called the shadow again. The cabin, I said. Be there. Audio, video, whatever you can get. He grunted assent, and I hung up, the wheels turning. Meanwhile, I played the doting husband. I cooked her favorite stew, asked about her flowers, watched her lie through her teeth. She glowed, oblivious, her excitement for the trip bleeding through her words. I'll miss you, she said one night, her head on my chest. I stroked her hair, murmured agreement, and pictured her with him, the crimson dress discarded on a cabin floor. The hypocrisy of her touch burned, but I endured it, biding my time. The lumberyard became my refuge. Splitting wood, hauling logs, the physicality a balm for the chaos in my skull. Friday came, and she left, her van rattling down the drive. I waved, then grabbed my keys. I didn't follow her, not yet. The shadow was in place, and I had another stop. Claire Ellison's open house. It was a risk, but I needed to see her up close, gauge her. The home was a sprawling ranch, all white walls and staged furniture. She greeted me at the door, her handshake firm, her eyes appraising. Looking for a new place? She asked. Maybe, I said, wandering the rooms, dropping hints. Mark's name, a vague mention of late nights. She stiffened once, but smiled through it. I left with her card, her suspicion a seed I'd planted. The weekend crawled by, each hour a taut wire. Emily texted once. Arrived safe, love you. And I replied with a heart, the lie of it bitter on my tongue. I spent Saturday at home, the silence thick, her absence a mocking echo. The shadow called that night, his voice low. Got it. Videos clean. Sending tomorrow. I thanked him, my pulse quickening, and poured a whiskey, the burn steadying me. Sunday, she returned, sun-kissed and radiant, spinning tales of hiking and solitude. I listened, nodded, and waited for the package that would unravel her world. It arrived Monday, a USB drive in a plain envelope. I locked the office door at the lumberyard, plugged it in, and watched. The footage was stark. Emily and Mark in the cabin, their voices clear through hidden mics. Laughter, whispers, moments I couldn't unsee. She called him hers, promised more weekends, while he grinned, smug and possessive. The camera caught it all, them tangled on a rug, the crimson dress a heap by the fire. I stopped it halfway, my stomach roiling, but the audio lingered, her saying my name, laughing at how clueless I was. That broke something in me. Not the act, but the mockery. 12 years reduced to a punchline. I burned the video to a disk, printed stills, and drove to Claire's office. She was alone, flipping through files when I walked in. "We need to talk," I said, dropping the envelope on her desk. She frowned, opened it, and paled as the photos spilled out. "What is this?" she whispered. "Your husband and my wife," I said. "There's video too." She stared, hands trembling, then nodded. "What do you want to do?" We planned it there, two strangers bound by betrayal. Claire's anger matched mine, her voice steel as she spoke of Mark's lies. We agreed they'd suffer together publicly, irreversibly. The cabin video was our weapon, but we'd wield it with precision. I suggested a dinner. Us, them, a staged reconciliation, and she latched on. "I'll host," she said. "They won't suspect a thing." I left her office, the alliance sealed, and drove home to Emily's oblivious smile. That night I proposed it. "Let's have dinner with friends next week. Something nice." She hesitated, then agreed, her curiosity piqued. I smiled, kissed her forehead, and thought of the disc, the photos, the reckoning. Revenge wasn't just coming. It was a storm, and I'd built the thunder. The days before the dinner stretched like a taut rope, every moment a test of my composure. Emily fluttered around the house, oblivious to the noose tightening around her. She hummed while folding laundry, asked me about table settings, even suggested a new wine to pair with Claire's cooking. I played along, my voice steady, my smiles practiced. Inside, I was a furnace, anger and anticipation stoking each other, fueled by the images burned into my mind. The video sat locked in my desk at the lumberyard, a silent grenade waiting for its pin to be pulled. Claire and I had spoken twice since our meeting, her voice clipped but resolute over the phone. "Friday," she confirmed. "My place. Bring the disc." I spent those days refining the edges of our scheme. Claire's home would be the stage, a sleek, modern space with glass walls and a long dining table, perfect for what we'd planned. She'd invited Mark under the guise of a casual night, telling him I was a potential client she'd met at the open house. Emily, meanwhile, thought it was a spontaneous double date, a chance to meet new people. The lies they'd spun for us now wove their own trap, and I relished the irony. At work, I hauled lumber with a ferocity that startled the crew, my hands raw by day's end, the physical strain a tether to my sanity. Thursday night, Emily tried on dresses, twirling before me in the bedroom. "This one?" she asked, holding up a teal number, modest, unlike the crimson she saved for him. I nodded, my throat tight, picturing her in that other fabric, laughing at my ignorance. "You look beautiful," I said, the words ash in my mouth. She beamed, kissed my cheek, and I turned away, feigning a cough to hide the clench of my jaw. Later, I slipped the disc into my coat pocket, its weight a promise. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind replaying her voice from the video. Clueless Jacob, until dawn broke, gray and heavy. Friday arrived, and we drove to Claire's in silence, Emily's perfume filling the cab of my truck. She chattered about her day, orchids, a tricky client, while I gripped the wheel, nodding at the right moments. Claire's house loomed ahead, lights warm against the dusk, and I parked beside Mark's sedan. Emily didn't blink at it, too caught up in adjusting her earrings. Claire greeted us at the door, her smile tight but convincing, her blonde hair pulled back sharply. "Jacob, Emily, so glad you could come," she said, ushering us in. Mark stood by the bar, pouring wine, his grin faltering when he saw me. Recognition, then confusion, quickly masked. "Hey, good to meet you," he said, extending a hand. I shook it, my grip firm, his ring cool against my palm. The table was set for 4, candles flickering, a charade of civility. Emily complimented the decor, oblivious to the undercurrent, while Mark avoided my eyes, sipping his drink too fast. Claire played her part flawlessly, charming, attentive, guiding us through appetizers as if this were any other night. I watched them, Emily and Mark, searching for cracks. A glance lingered too long, a laugh too forced, but they held their masks. Under the table, my hand brushed the disc in my pocket, a talisman of what was coming. Claire caught my eye across the plates, a silent signal. Soon, the meal stretched on, each bite a countdown, and I savored the tension coiling in the room like smoke. Claire cleared the plates with a practiced ease, her movements deliberate, drawing out the moment. "Dessert's next," she announced, disappearing into the kitchen. Emily offered to help, but Claire waved her off, insisting she stay. Mark shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping the stem of his glass, a nervous rhythm I catalogued. I leaned back, watching Emily sip her wine. Her lips curved in that effortless way I'd once adored. Now, it mocked me, a reminder of how easily she'd slipped into this double life. The air hummed with their ignorance, and I let it build, a predator pacing before the strike. Claire returned, not with dessert, but with a sleek remote in hand. "Before we eat more, I thought we'd enjoy a little entertainment," she said, her tone light but edged. She pointed it at the flat screen mounted above the fireplace, and the room stilled. Mark frowned, setting his glass down. "What's this?" he asked, a laugh caught in his throat. Emily tilted her head, curious, her fingers brushing her necklace. "A gift from me years ago." I said nothing, my pulse a steady drum. As Claire pressed play, the screen flickered, then bloomed with the cabin's interior. Wood walls, a crackling fire, and there they were. Emily and Mark caught mid-laugh, her in that crimson dress, him pulling her close. The audio kicked in, her voice clear. "Jacob's so clueless, he'd never suspect." Mark's chuckle followed, low and smug. Emily's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor, wine pooling like blood. Mark lunged for the remote, but Claire stepped back, her face a mask of ice. "Sit down," she snapped, and he froze, his eyes darting between us. Emily turned to me, her mouth open, words failing. "Jacob, she started, but I cut her off with a look, cold and unyielding. "Watch," I said, my voice ablade. The video rolled on, moments of tenderness, betrayal, her promising him a future while I faded into her past. Claire stood beside me now, arms crossed, her own fury a mirror to mine. Mark's face drained of color, his hands gripping the table as if it could anchor him. "Claire, this isn't," he stammered, but she silenced him with a glare. "You thought I wouldn't find out?" she hissed. The room was a tableau of shock. Emily trembling, Mark shrinking, Claire and I unmovable. The video looped to its end, the screen going black, but the echoes lingered. I pulled the disc from my pocket, held it up. "There's more," I said. "Copies, actually, ready to share." Emily's eyes widened, tears brimming, but I felt no pity, only the sharp satisfaction of their unraveling. Mark tried to stand, his chair scraping, but Claire's voice pinned him. "Stay. We're not done." She nodded to me, and I knew the real blow was yet to come. Silence gripped the room, thick and suffocating, broken only by Emily's shallow breaths. She stared at me, her face a crumpled mask of panic, as if she could will the last 5 minutes undone. Mark slumped in his seat, his bravado gone, a man deflated by the weight of his own deceit. Claire paced behind him, her heels clicking on the hardwood, a metronome to the chaos. I stood, deliberate, and walked to the bar, pouring myself a glass of Mark's expensive bourbon. The burn of it steadied me, a ritual before the next act. They watched, waiting, tethered to my silence. 12 years, I said finally, turning to Emily. "That's what you threw away. For him." I gestured at Mark, who flinched, his eyes on the floor. "And you," I said to him, "you took my life apart like it was a game, but it's not a game anymore." Emily sobbed, a choked sound, her hands clawing at the tablecloth. "Jacob, please, I didn't mean." I raised a hand, stopping her. "You meant every word on that video. Don't lie to me now." Her tears fell, but they were hollow to me, a performance too late. Claire stepped forward, her voice cutting through. "Mark, You've been lying to me for months, maybe years. I checked the accounts, your business trips, the gifts I never saw. All for her. She pointed at Emily, who shrank further into her chair. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it, defeated. I set my glass down, pulled an envelope from my coat. The Shadow's final gift. This, I said, sliding it across the table, is for both of you. They hesitated, Mark reaching first, his fingers trembling as he tore it open. Photos spilled out. More cabin shots, timestamps, even a shot of them in his office, blinds half drawn. There's an email too, Claire added, her tone venomous. Sent to your partners, Mark, and your clients. They'll see it Monday. His head snapped up, horror dawning. You can't. My business? She laughed, sharp and bitter. You should have thought of that before. I turned to Emily. And your shop? Your suppliers, your customers, they'll get a version too. Edited, of course. Enough to ruin you. She gasped, clutching her chest, as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. Jacob, no, please. I'll lose everything. I leaned close, my voice low, steady. You lost me first. The cruelty of it felt right, a balance restored. Mark tried to rally, standing now, his fists clenched. You're bluffing. You won't do it. Claire smirked, pulling her phone from her pocket. Already done. Check your inbox. He scrambled for his own device, swearing as the screen lit up with notifications. Messages, calls, the first ripples of ruin. Emily buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking, while I watched, unblinking, the architect of their collapse. The fallout was immediate, a storm breaking over them both. Mark's phone buzzed incessantly, a chorus of his life unraveling. Partners demanding explanations, clients pulling deals. He stumbled to the window, staring out as if escape lay beyond the glass. Emily remained at the table, her sobs quieter now, a broken doll in teal. Claire and I stood apart, united in purpose, watching the wreckage we'd wrought. It wasn't enough, not yet. The public shame was a start, but I wanted them to feel it deeper, a wound that wouldn't heal. Claire spoke first, her voice calm, deliberate. Mark, pack your things tomorrow. You're out of the house by Sunday. He spun, incredulous. You can't just... I can, she cut in. It's my name on the deed. You forgot that, didn't you? His jaw tightened, but he had no ground to stand on. I turned to Emily, who lifted her tear-streaked face to me. And you, I said, don't come home tonight. I'll have your stuff on the lawn by morning. She blinked, stunned. Jacob, where will I? Not my problem, I replied, turning away. Mark tried one last plea, his voice cracking. Claire, we can fix this. I'll end it, I swear. She laughed again, colder this time. You ended us the moment you chose her. Emily reached for me, her hand trembling. Jacob, I love you. I got lost. I stepped back, her touch repellent. You didn't get lost. You walked away. The finality of it settled over us, a door slamming shut. I nodded to Claire, and she handed me a second envelope. Legal papers drawn up fast by a friend of hers. Divorce filings for us both, served in tandem. Emily stared at the papers, her world crumbling further. You planned this, she whispered. We did, Claire said, her eyes glinting. You thought you could play us, but we played better. Mark swore, kicking a chair, his composure gone. I watched him flail, a man drowning in his own mess, and felt the first flicker of satisfaction. But it was fleeting. I needed more, a final twist to bury them. I thought of the shop, her pride, and his business, his identity. They'd lose those two, and I'd make sure of it. I left them there, Claire locking the door behind me, her own battle just beginning. Driving home, the night pressed against the windows, dark and endless. Emily's van stayed in Claire's lot. She had nowhere to go, and I didn't care. At home, I started packing her things. Clothes, books, the trinkets she'd collected, dumping them in bags. The wedding photo on the mantel went last, her smile frozen in a lie. I tossed it in the trash, the glass cracking, and stepped outside, the air cold and sharp. Revenge tasted bitter, but it was mine. Morning broke gray and unforgiving, the lawn strewn with Emily's life in black bags. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the street for her van. She didn't come, not yet, but I knew she would, drawn back by desperation. The disc still sat in my pocket, a weapon I wasn't done wielding. Claire called at 8, her voice steady. "Mark's gone. Left an hour ago." Begging. I didn't budge. I nodded, though she couldn't see. "Good. Emily's next." We'd agreed to push further, her shop, his career, the final pillars of their pride. I drove to the lumberyard, the routine a shield against the hollow in my chest. There, I emailed the video's edited clips. Moments of their laughter, her mocking me, his arrogance. To her suppliers, her landlord, even the local flower guild she'd chaired. Anonymous, untraceable, sent from a burner account the shadow had set up. By noon, her phone would light up with cancellations. Leases pulled, her reputation ash. Mark's ruin was already in motion. Claire had forwarded the photos to his biggest clients. His broker's license now at risk. We'd gutted them, but I wanted one last strike. At lunch, I met the shadow again, a diner booth between us. "One more job," I said, sliding cash across. "Her van. Make it disappear." He raised a brow, then nodded. "Done." That night, Emily finally appeared. Her face swollen from crying, her van rattling up the drive. She stepped out, saw the bags, and froze. "Jacob, please, let's talk." I cut her off, tossing her keys at her feet. "Take what you can carry. Rest goes to the curb." She knelt, gathering clothes, sobbing, but I turned inside, locking the door. An hour later, she was gone. Her van loaded, her pleas unanswered. The shadow texted at midnight. "Van's handled. Junkyard. Crushed." I pictured her tomorrow, stranded, her last tether snapped, and smiled faintly. Claire called again, triumphant. "His office is emptying out. He's finished." I leaned back, the house quiet, my revenge a cold flame. They'd lost everything. Homes, work, each other, and I'd orchestrated it all. But the emptiness lingered, a price I'd paid too. I poured another bourbon, the night stretching ahead. The cruelty had been meticulous, a symphony of their ruin, but it didn't fill the hole she'd left. I'd won, yet the victory was a shadow, dark and solitary. Still, I'd see it through, one final note to play. The days after Emily's departure blurred into a haze of quiet triumph and gnawing solitude. The house felt cavernous without her. Her laughter, her footsteps, even her lies had filled it with a pulse. Now it was just me, the creak of the floorboards, and the echo of my own thoughts. Her van's fate at the junkyard was a secret I savored, imagining her confusion when she woke to find it gone. Claire kept me updated. Mark had slunk to a cheap motel, his business imploding, his name mud in the real estate world. We dismantled them, piece by piece, but the hunger for more lingered, a beast pacing in my chest. I went back to the lumberyard, the rhythm of work a lifeline. The crew noticed my edge, sharper orders, heavier loads, but asked no questions. At night, I sifted through the wreckage of our life, boxing what remained of her presence. A letter slipped from a book she'd left, an old note from Mark, scribbled on a napkin. "You're my escape. Soon we'll have it all." Dated 6 months back, before the crimson dress, before I'd suspected. It stung, proof of how long she'd woven this web, but it also sharpened my resolve. They dreamed of a future over my ruins. I'd bury them in theirs instead. Claire met me at a coffee shop midweek, her eyes bright with a victor's gleam. "He's begging for a meeting," she said, stirring her latte. "Wants to explain." I told him to shove it. I nodded, sipping my black brew, the bitterness fitting. "Emily called me too," I said. "Left a voicemail, crying about the shop closing. Said she's sorry." Claire smirked. "Too late for sorry." We sat in silence, two generals surveying a battlefield, but I sensed her weariness mirrored mine. Revenge was a fire that warmed, then scorched. "One more move," I said finally. "Something they'll never forget." She leaned in, intrigued. What's the play? I'd been mulling it since the van. Something public, permanent, a scar on their souls. A billboard, I said. Downtown where they can't miss it. Their faces, the video stills. A headline, Cheaters Lose Everything. Claire's laugh was sharp, delighted. Expensive but brilliant. I'm in, split the cost. We shook on it, a pact sealed over cooling coffee. That night, I contacted a sign company, cash up front, no questions asked. The design was simple but brutal. Emily and Mark mid-embrace, her mocking words in bold, clueless Jacob. By Friday, it'd be up, a beacon of their shame. Emily's calls stopped, her number blocked, but I heard through the grapevine. Her shop shuttered, her friends icing her out. Mark's fall was louder. Lawsuits from clients, his license revoked. I drove past his motel once, saw his sedan parked crooked. A man broken. The billboard loomed in my mind, the final nail, and I slept better knowing it was coming. The cruelty wasn't just in the act. It was in its permanence, a reminder they'd carry forever. Friday dawned cold, the sky a slate of indifference. I drove downtown at sunrise, the lumberyard forgotten, my truck rumbling through empty streets. There it was, towering over the intersection, a 50-foot testament to their ruin. Emily's face, frozen in that cabin laugh, Mark's arm around her. The text blazing, Cheaters Lose Everything. Emily Carter and Mark Ellison. Below, smaller print. She mocked her husband. He betrayed his wife. Now they have nothing. I parked, stared, the weight of it sinking in. It wasn't joy I felt, more a grim satisfaction. A chapter closed with ink and steel. Word spread fast. By noon, my phone buzzed with texts from the crew. Photos of the billboard, thumbs-up emojis, a few damn boss remarks. Claire called, her voice alive. It's perfect. People are stopping, taking pictures. Mark's done for good. I heard the chatter through her line, her office abuzz, the gossip a wildfire. Emily? I asked. Haven't seen her, Claire said. But she'll know soon enough. I hung up, drove home, and waited. The silence of the house a stark contrast to the chaos I'd unleashed. She came at dusk, her van replaced by a battered sedan borrowed, I guessed. She stood on the lawn, staring at the empty space where her things had been, then at me through the window. I stepped outside, arms crossed, the air sharp between us. You saw it, I said, not a question. Her face crumpled, tears streaking mascara. Jacob, how could you? Everyone's laughing at me. I've got nothing left. Her voice broke, but I stood firm. You did this, I said. You and him. I just made it loud. She sank to her knees, sobbing, but I turned back inside, the door clicking shut. That night, Claire sent a photo, Mark at the billboard, head in hands, a crowd gawking. He's a ghost now, she wrote. I poured a bourbon, toasted the screen, and let the stillness settle. The revenge was complete, or so I thought, but a flicker of unrest lingered. Emily's pleas echoed, not softening me, but prodding. Had I gone far enough? The billboard was a blow, but it was fleeting. I wanted something deeper, a mark they'd carry in their bones. Sleep came fitful, the idea taking root. I woke with it fully formed. A final twist, subtle but eternal. I called Claire at dawn. One more thing, I said. Tattoos. She paused, then laughed. You're insane. Tell me. I laid it out. Hire someone, discreet, to ink them while they slept, a permanent brand of their betrayal. She hesitated, then agreed. I know a guy. It's crazy, but I'm in. The shadow was my next call. Cash doubled for this last job. No pain, I said. Just the mark. He grunted assent and the plan was set. The shadow moved fast, a phantom in their broken lives. Emily had crashed with a cousin, Mark still at the motel. Easy targets, both too shattered to lock their doors tight. I didn't ask how he'd do it. Sedatives, a quiet needle, his methods were his own. I only cared about the result. Claire picked the design. Betrayer in small, elegant script, etched where they'd see it daily, her wrist, his chest. A mirror's reminder, a scar no one else would question. By Sunday, it was done. The shadow texting confirmation. Both marked. Clean work. I paid him the last of my war chest spent and waited for the fallout. Emily called Monday, hysterical, her voice shrill through the line. What did you do to me? This thing on my wrist, it won't come off. I stayed silent, letting her rant, her panic a melody. You're a monster, Jacob, she screamed, then hung up. Mark's reaction came via Claire. He'd stormed her office, shirt torn open, the word betrayer red and fresh above his heart. He thinks it's me alone, she said, amused. Screamed about lawsuits, then left when I showed him the billboard photo again. We'd covered our tracks. The shadow was a ghost, the tattooist untraceable. The town buzzed with their disgrace. The billboard still up, a tourist attraction now. Emily's cousin kicked her out, unwilling to harbor the pariah. Mark's motel evicted him, his credit shot. They were untethered, drifting in the wreckage I'd built. And those tattoos, small, precise, were my final signature. I drove past her old shop, the windows papered, closed, scrawled in marker. A florist down the street nodded at me, a knowing look. Heard she's leaving town, he said. I shrugged, the victory cold but solid. Claire invited me over that night, a quiet celebration. We sat on her patio, the city lights below, glasses clinking. They're gone, she said, her tone softer now. Really gone. I nodded, the bourbon smooth, the night crisp. You okay? She asked, her eyes searching. I will be. I lied, the emptiness still there, a shadow revenge couldn't banish. We toasted anyway, two survivors of a war we'd won. But the cost lingered in the quiet between us. I went home, the house dark, the bags long cleared. Emily's scent was gone, her presence erased, but the tattoos stayed in my mind. A cruel perfection. They'd wake each day to that word, a mirror of their choices, and I'd sleep knowing I'd branded them forever. It was enough, I told myself, the beast in my chest finally still. Weeks passed. The billboard came down, its message etched in the town's memory. Emily vanished. Rumors said she'd fled north, a ghost of her former self, her wrist a secret she'd hide under sleeves. Mark surfaced once, a grainy photo online, selling his sedan at a lot, the tattoo peeking from his collar. Their lives were husks, and I'd stripped them bare, but the quiet in my own grew heavier. The lumberyard thrived, my hands steady on the saws, yet nights stretched long, the house a tomb of what was. Revenge had been a fire, but its ashes didn't warm me. Claire called less, her own healing begun, new clients, a fresh start. You should move on too, she said once, her voice gentle. I grunted, non-committal, the idea foreign. I'd won, hadn't I? Yet the victory felt like a weight, not a release. I found the napkin again, Mark's note, and burned it in the fireplace, the flames licking up his words. It didn't help. The tattoos, the billboard, the ruin. I'd orchestrated a symphony of pain, but the melody lingered in me too, a dissonant chord. One evening, a package arrived, no return address, just a small box. Inside, a photo. Emily, gaunt, her wrist exposed, betrayer stark against pale skin. A note, her handwriting. You win. I'll never forget. I stared, the words a hollow echo, then tossed it in the trash. She'd meant to wound me, perhaps, but it only steeled my resolve. Mark's turn came next. A letter, scrawled and furious, mailed from a nowhere town. You destroyed me, but you're empty too. Enjoy it. I read it twice, then shredded it, his defiance meaningless. I drove to the mountains, the cabin site, needing to see where it began. The place was locked, deserted. But I stood there, the wind sharp, picturing them inside, her laugh, his touch. The memory fueled me once. Now it just ached. I left, the road back a blur, and stopped at a bar, the first drink leading to 5. A woman smiled at me, kind-eyed, but I turned away, the thought of starting over a bridge too far. Revenge had been my compass. Without it, I drifted. Back home, I sat in the dark, the bourbon bottle half gone. The tattoos were my masterpiece, a cruel genius, but they didn't fill the void. Emily's betrayal had carved me out, and I'd answered with a vengeance that left me hollow too. I laughed, a bitter sound, and raised my glass to the empty room. To winning, I muttered, the toast a lie. Sleep took me there, the bottle slipping, the night swallowing me whole. Spring came, the trees budding outside my window, a mockery of renewal. I'd settled into a rhythm, work, home, silence. My life a narrow path. Claire moved on, remarried a quiet accountant, her calls rare now. I saw her once, at the market, her smile genuine, her hand on his arm. You should come by, she said, but I waved it off, the past a chain I still wore. Emily and Mark faded from talk, their names dust, but I knew they carried my mark, a whisper on their skin. That was enough, or it had to be. One morning, a man approached me at the lumberyard, grizzled, a stranger. You Jacob? He asked, voice rough. I nodded, wary. Knew your wife way back. Heard what happened. She's in Portland now, waiting tables, keeps her sleeves long. He paused, eyeing me. Said to tell you she's sorry. Meant it this time. I stared, the words a pebble in still water, then shrugged. Thanks, I said, turning back to my logs. He left, and I let her apology sink, unclaimed. Mark's end came quieter, a clipping in the mail, no sender. An obit, small-town paper. Mark Ellison, 42, passed in his sleep, motel room. No cause, no family listed. I pictured the tattoo, betrayer over his heart, and wondered if it followed him beyond. The paper went in the fire, its edges curling, and I felt nothing, just a blank space where rage once lived. Their ruin was complete, my hands the architect, but the blueprint had cost me too. I sold the house that summer, the memories too thick, and bought a cabin, smaller, remote, mine alone. The lumberyard kept me tethered, the work honest. Nights, I sat by the lake, the water still, reflecting a sky I barely recognized. The tattoos, the billboard, the years, they'd shaped me into something hard, unyielding, a man who'd won and lost in equal measure. I carved a bench by the shore, no name, just lines, and sat there often, the silence my companion. The beast was gone, its hunger sated, but the man left behind was a shadow too. Emily and Mark bore my mark, their lives a cautionary tale, and I bore theirs, a quiet, cruel victory that echoed in the empty spaces. I'd built their end, step by vicious step, and it was done. The lake rippled, the wind sighed, and I watched, alone, the story closed.